Welcome back again after the second coffee break of today. The last part of the program will be another lecture followed by Q&A, and then we will have the final panel discussion of the day with a number of poll questions. Rik Peels, he is the speaker of this slot, the lecture, and he will talk about replication and replicability in the humanities. Now, Rik is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Philosophy Department, and he's also engaged in the Department of Religion. He is doing a lot of interesting stuff on the ethics of belief, being it religious belief, being it radical belief, doesn't matter that much. He's doing a lot in that area. And he has an ERC starting grant on studying extreme beliefs, which is something of our times, of course. That is not what he's going to talk about today. Today is more in line with the third project he's involved in with the Templeton Foundation, and that is the project about progress in the universities. And more specifically, one of the sub-projects of that is, and I have the privilege to collaborate with Rik on that, replication in the humanities. A few years ago, we started to write about the topic. That led to a lot of fun and a lot of debates. We learned a lot from it, and we hope now we have two postdocs about to start a project of reproduction in the humanities. That will be a proof of principle type of thing to let's have a look whether it's possible to do a replication study in the humanities. But I've seen your presentation, Rik. It's about a lot more. So without further ado, I'll give you the floor and teach us a little bit the way in the replication issues in the humanities. There you go.
All right. Thank you very much, Lex, for your kind introduction. And let me start by thanking you, as well as Samira and Yuri as well, and Doreen for organizing this splendid summer seminar. I'm really impressed with it so far, and also glad with the impressive attendance. I think about 300 people, so that's just wonderful. All right. That being said, today I'm going to talk, as said, about the possibility and desirability of replication in humanities. So first, a few words on what's on the menu today. So the first section of my talk, really. So as has been mentioned already earlier today, for instance, by Daniel Lakens, there are concerns about replication, especially in the biomedical sciences and the social sciences, and some talk about a replication crisis. As Daniel Lakens already pointed out, some others talk about theory crisis or yet some other kind of crisis. Anyway, it's clear things are not always going as they should be going. All right. Now, this applies primarily to empirical work. So that is work involving collected data and involving inductive and abductive reasoning, rather than, say, a priori work as done in mathematics or in logic, where people use primarily or mostly deductive reasoning. So I'm going to confine myself to empirical work today. Now, many causes have been drawn attention to for the failure to successfully replicate. Among them are fraud, falsification, plagiarism, maybe more important, questionable research practices, partly due to unhealthy research systems, but also human error, changes in conditions and circumstances, lack of peer review, lack of rigor. Many different causes can be pointed out. Now, I think it's widely agreed nowadays, even though there's still more work to be done, that successful replication is actually valuable. And there are different reasons for that. So among other things, it aids scientific progress simply because replicated results are, in a specific sense, more likely to be true. It also prevents the waste of valuable resources, like financial and time resources. If they are applied, but not replicable, they are more likely to cause harm to individuals, animals, society. And maybe most importantly, in a way, is if time and again results turn out not to be replicable, that in the long run tends to erode trust in science. So trust among academics, but also, of course, beyond academia. Hence, replication is crucially important. And today, the question on the table is, how should we think about replication in the humanities? Is it possible? Is it desirable? And as Lex already pointed out, we have jointly, the two of us have jointly written a couple of papers on replication in the humanities. And so I'm going to say a couple of things today, 20 minutes or so, to convince you that replication is indeed possible and desirable in the humanities. And so let me say that to the extent that you find that plausible and convincing, that's probably Lex's part. And to the extent that you still have questions or worries, that's probably my part of the work. But I'll still do my best to convince you. All right, brings me to the second part. Just a few words on the key terms. So humanities, what do I mean by that? Roughly anthropology, archaeology, classics, history, linguistics, literary studies, philosophy, the study of arts, and theology. Debates about the exact boundaries of the humanities, I will leave for another time. What is a replication study? Roughly, I take it to be an independent repetition of an earlier study, usually, not always, usually, answering the same study question by using the same or similar methods under the same or similar circumstances. Now, it's quite common to distinguish three different kinds of forms of replication. Reanalysis of existing data sets, that's often called a reproduction. Collection of new data, but using pretty much the same study protocol, the same method in particular. That's often called a direct replication. And third, collection of new data using a revised or a modified study protocol, and that's often called a conceptual replication. So I'll be using that threefold distinction. And maybe a final distinction before we get into the meat of the matter is that between replicability and replication, somewhat analogous to that between falsifiability and falsification. So I take it that replication means that a study is actually replicated, whether it's successful or not, right? Replicability is slightly different. It is the collection of those features of a study that make replication possible in the first place. So for instance, a relatively lucid, transparent description of which method was used. So if those things are absent, then you cannot even replicate in the first place. So it fails to meet even basic criteria. All right. And that brings me to the third section of my talk, namely the issue of, is replication possible in humanities? I'm going to provide two arguments. The first one being a conceptual argument. And it's basically this. It just follows from the concept of replication and what the humanities do, that replication is indeed possible in the humanities. So as I said, to carry out a replication study is to carry out an independent repetition of an earlier study. Well, of course we can do that in the humanities, right? We can reanalyze the original data, we can slightly revise a study protocol, or we can add new data and assess whether the original result still holds. Surely we can do that. So it just follows from the very concepts involved that replication is possible in the humanities. And if you still have somehow hesitations about that, there's also a slightly more inductive argument, namely that replication has already been carried out, even though it has not always been set up explicitly as a replication. Just a couple of examples. So there's been a lot of work. So I mentioned Vandenberg, I think, in the bibliography for an overview, studying the influence Gnosticism had on the philosophy and theology of Augustine. And time it has been confirmed that Augustine was influenced by Gnosticism, but at certain points in his life later on, crucially diverged from basic tenets of Gnosticism. So that has been time and time affirmed, and basically nobody questions it in the field. And somebody used the same data, some people added new data to it, had a look at works that they hadn't had a look at before, and so on. A second example is the process of deciphering the Egyptian hieroglyphic as found under the famous Rosetta Stone in 1799. So there are three languages on the stone: Demotic, hieroglyphic, and ancient Greek. And they were unfamiliar with hieroglyphics, so they used Demotic and ancient Greek to come to an understanding of the hieroglyphic on the stone. So they just used two different languages to make sure that the translation that they came up with was correct, right? And the final example is slightly more recent, 2013. They rediscovered, in a sense, an old Van Gogh. So it was established that this was indeed a Van Gogh. It was hidden in an attic in Norway somewhere for many years. Sunset at Montmajour. And they used different methods to, and ended up with the same result time and again. So they used certain letters, they used certain methods of chemical composition study, they looked at the colors, they studied the theme of the painting, and so on. So here again, we see a particular case of replication, even though it was not formally set up as a replication, but obviously can easily be done so. Now, of course, I need to stress that there is variety and similarity when it comes to different methods in the humanities, right? So for instance, in linguistics, a formal method works rather differently from the sort of more connoisseurship approach that you find when it comes to the study of art. But I don't find that problematic at all, because you find radically different methods in the sciences, and even within particular sciences or particular scientific subdisciplines themselves. All right. Still, there can be a couple of objections, and there have been, if you look at the literature, a couple of objections against this idea of lex and mine. And I would like to mention and try to rebut 3 of the most important objections that you find in the literature. So here we go. Number 1, uniqueness. Some people feel that the objects in the humanities, like Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse, are unique. There's only one of them. Whereas in the sciences, you can study, say, an atom or a particular virus or disease time and again, because there are many of them, or many instances. So isn't that a problem for replication? Well, my reply is, no, that is not a problem. For instance, because in the sciences, there are also unique objects like the whole of space-time. There's, as far as we know, things look now, there's only one of it. And still we can study it and carry out replication studies of things, for instance, related to the Big Bang, which occurred only once. But second, and even more importantly, the issue of uniqueness doesn't really matter, because the issue is not whether there is a unique object, but whether we can draw data from and about that object, and maybe new data, or use a new method on that particular object or multiple objects, right? So the unicity or multiplicity of the object is really an irrelevant issue, I would say. All right, second, some people have drawn out, so Sarah de Rijk and Bart Penders are among them. You will find the references in the literature. They've pointed out that the humanities seek meaning beyond truth. And I think they're quite right about that, but I still fail to see how that would count against the idea of replication in the humanities. And among other things, that is because even if the humanities seek meaning beyond truth, they also seek truth. For instance, was this particular painting made by Vincent van Gogh or not? Right. So that's a simple factual question that you can study and that you can provide an answer to. Things are slightly more complicated because maybe they're also factual or at least alethic answers. So answers in terms of truth or falsehood when it comes to questions about meaning. For instance, the meaning of a text, right? It seems some interpretations are better than others. But even if things were problematic there's ample of opportunity to study factual issues. All right, third and final objection. Some people have pointed out that the object of the humanities are often humans, right? The humanities, and that humans are usually, unfortunately, interactive entities, right? They tend to talk back, that sort of thing. And that somehow makes a replication impossible. All right, so here again, I don't really feel the pull because, among other things, it seems to me in the sciences as well, we study human beings, right? And they interact, for instance, with their environment. But even if we leave the sciences aside, the fact that human beings are interactive might make things slightly more complicated, but it doesn't as such rule out replication, right? It maybe makes things more complicated when it comes to a primary or original study in the first place, because there are more contextual factors to take into account, right? And of course, the humanities study much more than just humans. They also study texts and paintings and letters and statues and all sorts of archaeological objects. All right, so I'm not entirely convinced by these 3 objections, but maybe I'm overlooking some serious weight or pull here. So do let me know if you think that's the case. All right, that brings us to the 4th section of my talk. Is replication desirable in the humanities? And my reply is yes, indeed. For many different reasons, and among them are the following. Replication can show that the original study cannot be successfully replicated in the first place, right? So that will be a problem. It can filter out faulty reasoning or misguided interpretations. It can draw attention to unnoticed crucial differences in study methods, bring new or forgotten old evidence to mind. It can provide new background knowledge. It can detect the use of flawed research methods, and so on. So replication is not only valuable for making original results more likely, but also for the whole enterprise of doing research and improving our way of doing research, even independently of the likelihood of the original results. So here's an example, Samuel Huntington's 1993 article, The Clash of Civilizations, which he then translated into an entire book. It's been cited about 20,000 times, so it's been quite influential. So I mentioned this number for people with more of a bit of an exact or a better background. So for humanities people, that's quite impressive. The main idea of the book is that in the future, at least when this book was written, 1993, wars would occur not so much between nations, but between different kinds of cultures or civilizations. And in particular, he believed Islamic extremism would come to be kind of a major force. And he backs this up by numerous historical examples. And what one could do, for instance, is just select particular sub-conclusions, because the book as a whole is rather large, but then just try to replicate by considering the original evidence and maybe adding new data to it, or possibly even a slightly revised method or protocol. Final point before we go to particular guidelines, there's something paradoxical about replication. So people sometimes ask me how much replication is needed in the humanities, and I tend to answer that I don't really know. And the paradox here is that we do need to carry out replication studies in order to find out how much they are needed. Right, but that's just one of the many paradoxes in life and even in science. So I'm perfectly happy to live with it, to embrace it. All right, that brings us to section 5, into the practicalities. Yes, section 5. So this is the next slide. Thank you so much. Yeah, guidelines. So let's make things practical. So here they come, what I consider to be a couple of helpful guidelines. If we carry out replication studies in the humanities, I would suggest we focus on studies that employ an empirical method. And that's because in a priori methods, for instance, metaphysics or epistemology or ethics, things just really work differently. So data are not collected data, but data are intuitions, or it's actually rather complex what the data are there. So I would just leave that aside. Start with the easier stuff. Second, I would replicate cornerstone studies, so studies on which many other studies are built, or in some case, maybe a random selection from a particular subdiscipline, right? Third, scrutinize the study's replicability before attempting to replicate it. So in order to prevent waste of time and resources, so not carrying out a replication if it's not even replicable in the first place, right? You can save a lot of time and energy in that way. Fourth, attempt to replicate by either reanalyzing the existing data sets, collecting new data sets with the same study protocol, or new data with a revised or modified study protocol, right? So depending on the circumstances, one can employ one or maybe multiple of the 3 different kinds of replication study that one can carry out. Opt, if possible, for conceptual replication. So that is in a way the strongest evidence one can provide for the plausibility of the original results, so that triangulation becomes possible, where I take the boundary between a conceptual and a replication and triangulation to be somewhat gray. It's a boundary area. And finally, once the replication attempt has been carried out, let's reevaluate the need for further replication. All right. Finally, a few practical comments. Lex and I have written a couple, maybe 6 papers or so now about replication. Those were rather theoretical, really. So we explored the concept or the concepts involved and gave these arguments and met objections that were leveled against angry humanities scholars who thought the idea was false or dangerous or something along those lines. And now that we've done that, I think, and we think it's time to get our feet in the mud, so to say, So over the next few years, we will actually be carrying out replication studies in the humanities. So I'd like to list them here. The first one is a 1991 book, John Henry Brooke, or at least one particular chapter in it on societal revolution and revolution in science. It's on the relation between science and religion, and that will be carried out by 2 postdocs. And another study that we're still preparing is a study from art theory. So here we have got 2 paintings, one in the Netherlands, one in Germany. And it turned out that the one in the Netherlands was not a true Rembrandt, whereas the one in Germany is. And that is still the mainstream view. And we aim to replicate these particular 2 articles on these 2 paintings as well, right? And clearly these involve drastically different methods. So using text versus using X-ray, chemical composition, themes, just art theory in general. About the results, so we will publish, or we intend to publish these results as separate articles in the relevant field journals, but then also to come back to the issue of replication humanities and to reflect on what all of this means for the entire endeavor of replicating in the humanities. So I would say, yeah, to be continued, to be followed up, and we aim to publish and share the results on our website. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you today, and thanks so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions and comments. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Rik. That surprised me that you're already strictly on time. That's great. It was indeed interesting to see your presentation, and it was food for thought again. I especially like your style. Just words, no formula, no pictures, no statistics, no graphs, no nothing. Just words, flowing words, and well, quite easy to understand, quite didactical. You strongly argue in favor of reproducibility in the humanities. You're not claiming that everything should be reproducible, but maybe you're arguing that a lot is reproducible. And that leads to the first question. And it's interesting, I'm going to read it because it's a bit complex. Hans van Eygen, he says, well, now this replication in the humanities, how is that different than rebuttals or defenses of existing arguments or theories in the humanities? For example, historians have tried to corroborate theories in history by reanalyzing historical data in support or against it in more detail or finding new data. The term replication we rarely use, but we may be doing it all the time. That's basically what he is saying. And the point is, do you agree, or is what you propose different from what Hans is proposing?
Yeah, splendid question. So Hans van Eygen is actually one of the postdocs in the projects.
Yeah,
so it's good to be on the same level here.
That. So he will be fired maybe after this session, but don't do that.
No, it should be fine. So the way I think of it is that indeed something close to replication is already kind of common practice in many humanities, as for instance, the Gnosticism and Augustine example that I mentioned shows. And yet I think there is something to be gained if we explicitly phrase this in terms of replication. So I think what can be gained, among other things, is that we can carry in the whole experience rather than reinventing the wheel from the whole replication crisis, for instance, in the biomedical sciences or in social psychology. And we can do things that have not been done before. For instance, we can try to pre-registrate certain studies. That is utterly uncommon in the humanities, but there are clear advantages to doing so. For instance, it may be easier in that way to meet certain biases that researchers may have, right? So doing it in a slightly more formal way, basing our work on the experience of others, will, I think, bring in certain profits that we would otherwise miss. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that being said, maybe it's fair to say that the humanities have been overall doing better in replicating than the sciences, even though they didn't use the word.
Yeah, that might be the case. Words matter in that sense, of course. Mitte Reuver has a very practical question. What are your favorite examples of replications in the humanities?
So ones that have already been carried out?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I tend to like this. So this Van Gogh example strikes me as particularly useful. And that is because one of the lovely things about art theory is that you can use, so I love it for the sake of conceptual replication, is that you can use 6 different methods to verify or falsify an original result. So for instance, when it comes to Van Gogh, you can check the diaries that he delivered. You can study the chemical composition. You can do a provenance research. So who owns the painting, then who owned it prior to that, who owned it prior to that. You can do dendrochronology. So you can study the frame that was used and study the age of the tree, right? And there's of course more ways, right? Like infrared, for instance. So there's all these different methods that you can use, and time and again you can, if successful, you can confirm the original result, and that is just, I think, splendid about it. So I particularly love that example.
Yeah, and it all has been done, and that's intriguing as well. Yeah, it's really nice. Yeah. Alma Linka-Viet-Tjute, I believe she's called. She has a really practical question as well. How can I get funding for my replication studies in the humanities? Where can I find it? Are there really outlets? There is so little funding, and it seems to be for innovative primary studies completely. Where can we find the money?
Right, yeah. So in the Netherlands, we had a call a few years ago for replication, and that was just replication in the sciences. And then Lex and a few other people talked to the right people, and then they changed the call. So the humanities were included at some point. So what I hope is that like national science foundations, like institutions, will actually start calls to replicate, including in the humanities. So that will hopefully be one way to get funding for this. Maybe you've got further ideas yourself, Alex, about funding.
Yeah, well, it's still difficult, and we're now struggling to get another round of that program in the air. And if it happens, it will include the humanities, but that won't help people abroad. Yeah. The issue is both the National Academies of Sciences in the US and the humble small one in the Netherlands issued a report on replication and replicability, and both committees didn't dare to say which proportion of grant money should be invested in replication and which in innovative stuff. In some areas, in our committee, the Dutch committee, we thought maybe more money should go to replication than to innovation for a while, because we have a backlog of replications, like Daniel argued this morning as well. And in other fields, well, people might be doing a good job already, like molecule design in chemistry. They replicate all over the place, and they usually publish an innovative study together with a lot of replication attempts in one paper. And so there might be less need for replication studies. So it might be depending on the disciplinary field in which you are, but I believe it's fair to say that there is a shortage of money for replication research. And I see no clue that the EU, which is the biggest granting agency we are facing in Europe, is changing the attitude on that plane. Yeah. And it also needs to happen in committee members, of course.
Yeah, so maybe one way to go is just to build in a replication component in a research proposal for original research.
Yeah, that has been proposed in social sciences as well, that when you start doing your PhD, you start with a replication in your field first, and from then you move on. But that's only possible when you have small studies, which are relatively inexpensive, of course.
Yep.
Yeah, that's true. Madi Khalidi, he or she says, what happens if you try to replicate and you are not successful? Right. What do you conclude? What do you do next? What is the next step you have to take in the humanities again?
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's quite possible. And so the challenging issue then will be what follows from it. And then then of course it will be fascinating to see whether we can find out exactly why we have not been able to replicate successfully. And there are rather large differences between the reasons there. So if you can't replicate because the study isn't replicable in the first place, then maybe recommendations would follow about setting up studies in the humanities more in such a way that replication is possible in the first place. But it might also be the case that certain biases are detected in the original study, right? There are many possible outcomes, so it really depends on the details. Yeah. I'd be happy either way, to be honest. So the purpose is not to successfully replicate. The purpose is to try to replicate.
Yeah, that's the purpose. And it might be even more interesting if you are not successful than if you are successful. You might learn something from that. And that happens in other disciplinary fields as well, of course. Then you see that a tiny detail that did not seem to be important, in fact, is important for how the way you study leads to findings and conclusions. That's really nice. Now, we are lucky, Rik, that you are a philosopher. The next question is a little bit on the plane of philosophy as well. I can follow it, I believe, but I'm glad that I don't have to answer it. Marthe de Boer, she writes, I still have a problem. This whole notion of replication and replicability seems to come from a completely positivistic worldview. And she suggests by saying that, I believe, that there are other worldviews, and she also tells, these are probably authors, Lincoln and Guba, for instance, discussed this matter in earlier days, and I'd like to hear what you think about it. So is this a positivistic game, Popperian game, like you alluded to yourself maybe, or is replication and replicability also relevant when you are doing your research in another framework?
Right, yeah. So like a full answer would have to be a little bit longer than what I'm going to say now.
You have some time, but
we've got some time.
Not
right,
an hour, not an hour.
Okay, good. Yeah, so the way I think of it is logical positivism said that statements are meaningful. This is going to be a bit of a philosophical answer. Only if they are either empirically verifiable or if they are tautological. So if they're analytically true statements. And this whole issue of replication has nothing to do with those two claims. So I don't think it's positivist in any sort of sense. I think the positivistic flavor might be in there if you impose it as a necessary criterion for proper science. So and that is in a sense positivistic. So if we were to say, look, if a study fails to replicate, then it is pseudoscience or not proper science or rubbish or false or anything along those lines. And I would like to stress emphatically that that is not the purpose of what we're doing, right? So there are many potential analyses that could follow from failure to replicate, and certainly not to just flat out reject the original study. But the way I see it is that it would lead to further scrutiny. And maybe it's also important to emphasize that, as I said at the outset, not all studies in the humanities lend themselves well to replication. So we should be sensitive. And maybe studies, for instance, hermeneutics that concern issues of meaning and value are boundary cases. So we won't start with those, as should be clear from the examples that I gave.
Yeah.
So I'm firmly against any sort of positivism myself. So I don't know whether that helps.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So you're good company with Martin then, I guess. Yeah. The point is, and some people are struggling with that as well, like myself. You alluded to that already in your talk, Rik. The relatively easy thing seems to be empirical research. Yeah. What about other types of research, like you alluded to already, like hermeneutics, informatics, mathematics, maybe design type of activities, analytic philosophy, or what have you? Yeah. Would there be a place? Can you envision a type of replication debate there as well, or is it completely useless in these other non-empirical arenas? What do you think?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a personal thing, but I'm inclined to think that it would not be entirely useless there, but it would work slightly differently. So so as I said, I would propose we start with the easier cases, right? So there are clear analogies between the empirical fields in humanities and those in the sciences. So let's start with those, because it has not been done very often systematically. So let's do that first, and then draw certain lessons from it and see what we can borrow and what we cannot borrow for hermeneutical methods, for instance. But of course, there will be certain similar issues. For instance, maybe in hermeneutical studies, people are insufficiently explicit about the study protocol because they believe it is shared, whereas people in carrying out a hermeneutic method actually employ slightly different methods. And there is something to be gained in becoming explicit about that. Or when it comes to biases, right? So I don't want to rule out at the outset that it could be relevant there as well, but I prefer to start with the easy cases.
Yeah, let's start with the easy ones. And Marta responded, you were like this, Rik. Thanks for your answer, but then a different use of language would be applicable.
All right, yeah.
You might agree to that, but please respond.
Yeah, yes, we might have to use slightly different language there, so as not to be confusing. I agree with that, yeah. Yeah, but of course we can borrow certain ideas, even if we use different language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is one thing I'm intrigued about myself, and that is Daniel Lakens told us this morning to take serious questions serious, meaning that only do research on important things, try to agree before you embark on research whether a thing is important, and when it is important, it is by definition a cornerstone study that deserves a replication attempt. Would you agree to be that strict and severe for the humanities as well? Or is that more a playground where you can also do studies which are not so important to be necessary to replicate them?
Right, yeah, so I would maybe indeed, since the resources for replication are rather limited, when it comes to replication, I would indeed advocate being rather strict in the selection of replication studies. When it comes to humanities, like original primary studies, I would be more lenient, really, because I think the humanities should be a playground for crazy research and crazy ideas, even if their value is not immediately obvious. Pretty much foundational research.
Yeah, And that comes near what Daniel told us this morning as well, that maybe 80% of research should be serious and focusing on important stuff that deserves replication once you start doing it. And the other 20% is the playground to tease out other ideas. Would that be similar in the humanities, or would be 20-80 the other way around? I'm being provocative again, Rik. Try.
Well, yeah, so I would probably, I don't know about percentages really. Yeah, maybe go for the same percentage. But I mean, since there have been so many budget cuts for the humanities, like for instance, a few years ago, Japan closed 60 humanities departments in the country at once because they didn't provide any like technologically useful knowledge. I mean, we should be careful not to have the image of being hobbyists too much, really. Yeah. So there are policy issues there as well.
Yeah, that's right. It was provocative, and I agree with you. And it's really a sad story what happened to the humanities, and we're not a single country where that is happening. And we hope in this current Templeton project, we hope to provide more arguments to show that the humanities are part of the bunch and relevant as an endeavor in academia as such. Yeah, that is important.
And can do highly rigorous research.
Yeah, that's true, and that brings us on the path of replication again. Maybe in a slightly different way, maybe in slightly different words, but well, let's play the game seriously, but in a way that belongs to the humanities, of course. Yeah, great. There are no more questions, and I really like the presentation and the exchange we had. I suggest we move on to the general discussion. 4 of the 6 people are there. The 2 other then might join later on. There are 3 on the screen and 3 are in the audience. May I invite you on the platform? The rhythm is, and I told it already several times today, we now try to weave a fabric together of what happened today, the different parts of the highly interesting meeting. I'm not sure that will be completely successful and whether the fabric will be completely without holes in it, but that's what we're going to try. Welcome, Michael. Welcome, Daniel. It's great to see you here again, even if we start a little bit earlier. The rhythm is that we have a few things to project, poll questions, 4 answer options, and then you get the opportunity to respond to what you see and what your own opinion is about the poll question and the way people responded to that. People can also still add remarks or questions in the Q&A session, and that will be feeded back as well. It's not really necessary that everyone speaks on every point, but you are allowed. Raise your hand, shout, start looking at me intensively when you want the floor. That is the way we're going to play it, a little bit flexible. Yuri, you want to have it already?
No, not yet.
Okay, not yet, that's good. Okay, let's, without further ado, start with the first poll question. Can you maybe start the first poll question? And that is, next to researchers, this day was about researchers, which stakeholder, only one, do you believe to have the strongest influence on fostering responsible research practices? Is that the research institute? Is that the scholarly journal, together with the publishers, of course? Is that the funding agencies? Or are these the learned societies, the collectives of researchers? So please cast your votes. Don't think too long. Put it in the Mentimeter. The number is there, and it worked already with Yuri, and there's some answers are popping up already.
No, this is the wrong one.
This is the wrong one, so please try again.
Those are no, this is...
No.
No.
No, you do day number 2, is that true, Yuri?
No, these are mine from last, from
maybe
my presentation.
On.
Yes, this is
there we go.
That's the one. I apologize for the inconvenience, but try again. I liked your answers, but to the wrong question, or the other way around. This is not a stable situation yet. We need some more votes. Please cast them. A lot of votes in favor of the research institutes. Stock of the scholarly journal goes down. No one is voting for learned societies, funding agencies. Now, why you vote on? Maybe Daniel, can I ask you the question, what would your take be on this issue? I know it's an impossible question. You can easily say that all are important, but that is not what you can do. You need to pick one and defend it, please.
Yeah, I think it has to be very close to the researchers. So in my experience, a lot of parties leave the responsibility to do good research and to evaluate what good research is up to the researchers themselves. So funding agencies are hesitant to say something like, what is good? The researchers should come up with this. And I think actually research institutions themselves also say there's so many different departments, we can't do this for you. Communities need to do it themselves. So I would say actually scholarly journals are very close. They're of our peers and decide what is good quality. So that would be my guess actually.
Yeah, sure. So the researchers themselves, but they're not on the screen, and scholarly journals are most close to that. Do you agree, Michael? You don't have many votes, but it might change as you pitch your talk here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the phrase there is about the strongest influence rather than who carries out the actual, implements of responsible research practices. And I do think there's a case for saying, well, follow the money. And if the money is what you need to do your research, then you're going to be tied to the influence that the body that gives you the funding is going to impose on you. So I guess I'd tentatively say the funder.
Yeah, you would say a funder. And to some extent, I tend to agree personally, because I often say funders don't need to be popular. We all want their money. What is your take, Marianne?
Yeah, I was also thinking, yeah, of course, the researchers themselves, so I agree in that extent with Daniel that it should be close by, but on the other hand, the money is also really important, and I really think that the funders can have a certain say in aligning these, the good ways to do researchers for science and also for the researchers, so aligning these incentives, and I think because they have the money, they can have a power there.
Yeah. And that is an important thing, and well, people can like it or not, but they need money for the research, so that is the way change is going. Yeah, like for instance with the FAIR principles of data and data management systems. What about you, Tamarin?
I think we talked a lot today about how can we incentivize particular practice and should we make things mandatory. And I think as an institution, you're going to have a really tough job in mandating some of the things we discussed today. But as a funder, as you said, you don't need to be popular. We want your money anyways. So it could be very cool if we get more funders to endorse some of the practices we talked today and to just put them out there as you just do it. Yeah,
you agree that funders are important. And Yuri, you're now writing a paper on that, what funders can do to improve research integrity. Do you agree, or what are the nuances of what is on the table?
Okay, so what I think is that there is the most progression can be made with the funders, because the Research Institute, they do already quite a lot. Journals are really already joined the bandwagon. The only thing that lays behind are the funders. They don't do not much yet on research integrity. They start to have more demands for research and research institute, but that's still in its infancy. So I really believe that we can make the biggest leap there, that we can have the biggest leap there in terms of fostering responsible research practices. But still, I believe that indeed being close to researchers, research institutes can do a lot. But they're already doing that, but they even can do more.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. And what about you, Rik? You alluded already to the fact that funding is mainly not present in the humanities, but do you agree that humanities are important, or is your take differently here?
Well, so I'm inclined to think that so many of these questionable research practices will be rather invisible to funding agencies and journals. And in many cases, I think colleagues will know at least a little bit about them, or will have a suspicion. Right. So I was thinking, I mean, there are different ways to interpret this question, but maybe the one has the most influence, who can most influence the kind of climate on the working floor, so to say. So anyone who can encourage like maybe weekly or monthly conversations on challenges in research practice, maybe research institutes can actually organize that or strongly encourage it. So I was leaning that way, but
yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense to me as well, and it's true, of course, that funding agencies are not all, or maybe none of them, really are doing a good job in checking whether research is done in the correct way. They are in the business of allocating grants mainly, and not in checking what is happening with the grants, with a few exceptions.
Yeah, and it will take a lot of further money to actually get them do that. So,
yeah, there is a lot of resistance there. That they take too much of the budget already. Many people think. I was surprised, Danielle, that you wouldn't vote for the learned societies, because to me that seems to be so near what you told us this morning. That the collectives need to get together and to decide what to investigate and how to investigate it, and we now. I'm writing with a bunch of people a paper about what guidance give learned societies in Europe. And it's quite amazing what is on the table already. It's not widely known, I believe, but isn't there a place for these learned societies as well that is slightly more positive than the 0 we got in the vote counting?
I think it's completely correct. And also they do a lot, actually. A lot of initiatives come from there. And I do think if they team up and reach consensus of things that the community thinks are important, they might do it. At the same time, I mean, there are initiatives, but I can't say that there are good examples where real big steps have been made. I'm not completely sure. Maybe I'm really not giving credit where credit is due. Nothing comes to mind, so maybe they just need to do their PR a bit more, and they're doing great things.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was surprised what was detectable when you really started searching what is there on the table. Many codes, guidelines, more courses, everything, but hardly anyone seems to know about it. So that is an issue. I agree. Yeah. This topic, this first question, is there any additional thing you want to remark on this? Any of you? If not, let's move on to the second poll. That's completely different in a way. Can we mount that one? And the second question is, which open science practice is the most important for strengthening trust in research? Is that open access? Is that open methods in the sense of pre-registration and also registered reports? Is that open codes, including the data analysis plans? Or is that pre-printing? That is the idea. It's there on the screen already. Please don't be shy. It's fully anonymized. No one will know who answered what, but we just want to have your votes. And there are no good or bad answers, of course. There are only different answers. So,
Lex, this is trust among researchers in research, or trust just among anyone?
Yeah, well, I forgot to tell the most important rule. You're not allowed to question the questions.
Ah, sorry. Okay, fair enough.
But you can take them to mean both, if that is not too complex. But you can comment on that. Well, what would you think it would be different for trust between researchers, or different and different with trust in society? Is that what you suggest?
Yeah, there might be a difference between them to the extent that these different means are like available to and visible for the like lay audience, right? So I can't see the four from here, like open what the four are.
It's open access, open methods, open codes, and preprints.
All right, yeah, so I think stuff like preprints won't make a difference to the public trust in research, right?
It might even lower it, doesn't it?
Might even lower it, exactly, yeah. But among my academics, that might make a difference, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're a real philosopher, always questioning the question and then not answering it.
Yeah. Well, what is your take, Yuri?
Well, of course, I'm a big fan of pre-registration. I think that would be the way forward to foster trust, to improve trust, strengthen it, because it's there you can show already beforehand what you're going to do, and you're very transparent. And I think transparency is key for trust. So that's what would be my take, of course.
And will be that mainly between researchers, or will it also work in society? The issue Rik was raising.
Yeah, well, the trust for it is, I think, and it's not within here. It's about the communication of science. That's all about trust and transparency. So that's something different, and that's not into one of those four categories, because it's really lay audience may not have the knowledge on methods. So even.
We need to explain them what science is all about.
Yeah.
If we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it science. Yeah. Things like that.
Yeah.
Marianne.
Yeah. Yeah. Also to continue with that. So like now I think it was mentioned also by one of the speakers that for the preprints you now have often this statement, or if people are discussing it in the popular press, then there is some statement about this isn't peer reviewed yet. It's a preprint. And of course, it would be nice that in some time we would have also a statement, this was a nice study, but it wasn't pre-registered. So that it is also part of the common knowledge that it's important that things are pre-registered and transparent, so that we're not only focusing on this, whether it's peer-reviewed or not, but also on other aspects, and also be able to communicate that when we are talking about our science.
Yeah. And we need to communicate that to the lay audience, the citizen scientist, if you like, and also to the media, most likely, because they need to pose the right questions and to look at the right information. like the badges you mentioned on the papers. Yeah. Tamarinde.
I believe I've actually learned this once from Daniel, so he may have to correct me, but I think there has actually been some work where people inquired lay people about these sort of issues. So they explained more in layman's terms about these sort of degrees of freedom. And people were outraged. I mean, that's not what we're paying for. That's not what we trust scientists to do. So this maybe pertains a little bit to Rik's question. Yes, if we phrase it this way, then it may be differently accessible. But if we actually, you know, bring down the problem to very understandable terms, I think both sort of scientists and the lay public would be happy to see these sort of approaches more rigorously carried out.
Yeah, that's interesting. Danielle, you want to comment on that? Because it seems to link with what you were telling this morning as well.
It's a study by Pickett and Roche in 2017, just to give them credit. And they asked the general public, what do you think of scientists who selectively report? And then some of them say, well, maybe it's a good idea to fire these scientists, which, you know, might be a bit extreme, but it's an understandable response. Yeah, and given that, I actually, when you said that registered reports fall under this second option, I also think registered reports and preventing selective reporting is a big one for the trust that the general public will have. I don't know if they completely understand the extent of the problem, but I think if they understand the extent of the problem, they will also like registered reports as a good solution to it.
Yeah, I can imagine. And what do you think, Michael? Will it be possible to teach the public what preprints are and what they are not? Because they seem to be there to stay, and they became more popular over days. Many scientists are excited about preprints, but people in the media and in the public at large, the understanding seems to be difficult, and the trust seems to go down due to preprints, maybe.
I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think there is actually quite a lot of excitement in the press, for example, about research that comes out as a preprint, and you often find it as a footnote that the research has not been peer-reviewed and it is only at preprint stage. I mean, the press always want a good news story, don't they? So anything that's exciting and cool and brand new is going to be, you know, their sort of bread and butter, as it were. I think going back to the point about communication about science, I think that's a really tough one, because there will be scientists who over-egg their results and who want to, you know, they want to say, you know, we're the first to do this and this is groundbreaking and whatever. And there needs to be an awareness that actually scientists themselves are not necessarily the best communicators of their own research. You almost need you do need a curation in a sense of the sort of research that gets published. And somebody needs to do some, I can't remember, was it Marianne who mentioned this, that you have a sort of a narrative around the research to explain its significance, its value, and those sorts of things. So yeah, sorry, that's quite a nuanced sort of response, really. I think it's complex.
Yeah, well, really nice. You want to respond, Marianne?
I have no response ready, but...
No, that doesn't matter, doesn't matter. You were looking whether you would like to respond, but Tamarinde is, please go ahead.
Maybe to add on to the point of the journalists, I do believe that we're also currently seeing a variety of initiatives where journalist organizations like the Open Notebook, for example, are trying to gather more feedback that would help them also, you know, read and interpret a preprint and then to know what are sort of good and less good practices. So, you know, we always tend to say that, yeah, and then the media run away with it and they inflate it. But I do want to say, especially among science journalists, there's more awareness about the issues we talk about today, and they also try to sort of educate themselves and look for feedback and how they could do that with due diligence.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a nice addition. Thank you. Michael, you want to respond?
Yeah, no, thank you, Tamarinde. You're spot on with that. And in fact, the journalist that I quoted in my talk earlier was, as I mentioned, she's a BMJ editor, an ex-editor from the BMJ. There are journalists who take their role very seriously and do a great job at communicating research. And there's organizations like Sense About Science in the UK who are there advocating for good practice in communicating scientific research and questioning the evidence and those sorts of things. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tamarinde.
Yeah, it's interesting. And that brings me to a science question in a way, maybe to Rik and also to Danielle and to Yuri. You are quite active on Twitter. Does that help for building trust among researchers And does it help to build trust in society, to take that thing that Rik brought on the table? I'm ambiguous about it myself. I learned it rather recently. I love it as a method to be guided to interesting new literature, but I'm very much in doubt of further usefulness. But maybe Danielle, you first. What do you think about Twitter in that sense?
I think there are some people who use it very effectively to counter misleading information. Carl Bergstrom comes to mind, who is very active on COVID-19 related issues and probably has hundreds of thousands of followers and says very sensible things in very clear terms. So it can be used for good things. I also think it might be interesting. I'm not sure how many people like to follow these things, but to see scientists debate about the quality of science. And I think one of the main instigators of the big changes we see in psychology in recent years is because social media brought a lot of people who had doubts about the way we were working together, but they were so fragmented that these people could, talk to each other and think, I'm not crazy. We should change something about this, right? Yeah, no, I also think you're not crazy. And that was very helpful. And maybe seeing that process, or maybe somebody in the humanities wants to write a nice article about how that went, is actually kind of maybe a bit inspiring even to see. So I'm a bit more optimistic about the good sides.
Yeah, Rik, do you share that positive view?
Well, so I see like tremendous Twitter threads and feeds every now and then, like splendidly clarifying how science works and so on. But the effectiveness of those, I'm afraid, also partially depends on the psychology of the people actually reading those tweets and the purposes for them joining Twitter. And there I might be slightly less optimistic. So it might actually be a medium that most people would have joined to, I don't know, express their emotions, their disdain in particular. So I tend not to idealize the medium, but maybe people change their views every now and then.
Yeah. Well, what about our psychiatrist?
Well, I think there's so much discussion already within science, whether science is an opinion or not. And I think Twitter is so much more about opinion. So many people have opinions there, and everybody can have an opinion, which is perfectly fine, but that reduces the level of scientific evidence that can be tweeted. So I think we should be very, very cautious in using Twitter. I don't do it under my name. I do it under the Enrin account, and I follow and I retweet, and I don't try to send opinions. So I think, well, we need a superb tweet course, something like that, and we need some guidelines on responsible tweeting for academics before we can really make that. Because it's on the one hand, of course, it has some beauty in it about tweeting, but there's just too much opinion to make it a very serious way to communicate.
I see one of your future grant proposals coming already.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Can I quickly add one thing to that? So Twitter has two sides. There are, of course, the tweets, but then there is also the backside of it, namely, for instance, all the articles and blogs that people refer to in their tweets. Yeah. And quite often, when these things are retweeted, they are read by people, even many people that are not on Twitter themselves, right? So they're forwarded, these pieces, because people find them referred to on Twitter, right? So it might have all sorts of beneficial side effects that you don't see on Twitter itself.
Yeah. Okay, great. Any other thing? Do you want to remark on Twittering? I'm not sure whether you're addicted to it already.
No, I'm not addicted to it. No, I have an account already for a very long time, but I'm almost never using it. It's mostly self-protection also because, there are many opinions and it's going very fast. And I not always have the time to join in. And I have another life as well that I want to focus on. So it's a kind of a protection thing to don't focus too much on it. And but I like the information that is coming from it. So I definitely use it sometimes to search for some topics or discussions or new blog posts or other information. So I think that's really nice. Yeah,
sensible user you are. And you're right, of course, that there is something more in life than only doing research. Well, what about you, Tamarin? Do you have a Twitter account already?
No, I was confessing today that this is one of the things I still managed to get away from.
Right.
So I think, but there's a very personal view that, you were talking about what are the reasons for people to get on Twitter. And this is totally my own biased opinion, but I feel like most scientists are purely on Twitter for self-promotional purposes. And I'm not really keen to do that in that particular sort of less nuanced way, but I do know, and I confided to Marjan today, that then if I do want to put something out there, or I do want relevant communities to engage with my work, I use other people to tweet for me. So I'm also not completely against or off it, but I still managed to get away with it, and I hope that this is one of those things they don't force you to do if you continue going into science.
Well, we discovered the species of, well, the parasite Twitterer, more or less.
Absolutely.
That's a good idea. Apologize for the pun. The point is, let's do one more issue, one more question. Let's do the third and also the last poll of today, and then debate it and call it a day. Please mount the next poll, and that is a slightly different form. It says, please select the statement you agree with most from the following. 1. PhD supervisors need a license to supervise based on solid training. 2. PhD supervision teams should always consist of at least 2 persons. 3. The quality of PhD supervision should be monitored by an independent committee, within the research institute if you like. And the last one, poor performance of PhD supervisors should lead to withdrawal of the right to supervise. Now, you may not like them all, or you may all like them, but please answer the one you like most, you agree with most. I look for hours to do this. It's hypnotic in a way.
Yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah, even if you're cheering for one, then you really want to have that one.
Yeah, the next one, the next one. So please leave it on. It's nice. It will go on moving. Tamarina, you raise your hand. You want to respond already to the one?
Yeah, I was triggered by the remark on the quality of supervision and the need for that to be monitored. And I'm really curious to also hear the opinion of the other panel members, but I think it's very closely related to a question I posed in my talk about what's the effectiveness of supervision training and what is then good quality. And I think that can be notoriously tricky, and I don't have an answer, but maybe especially looking at sort of Rik and Daniel, knowing them to be supervised with many people, I would be very keen to hear, at least from some of these panel members, what is good quality supervision, and also from Marjan, whom I know has mentored many PhD students.
So you want our views on what is good mentorship of PhD students. And you alluded to Danielle and Marjan, so maybe Marjan, you go first this one. How do we do the trick? How do you do the trick?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this morning as well, basically also on focusing on doing good science, so instead of doing it fast science. But yeah, I also, when I was listening to Tamarinde's talk this day, I was also like, yeah, I also didn't have any taken any course about supervision of PhD students, so there is definitely a lot to learn and to improve. But yeah, what is then quality? I think one way in looking at it is that it produces, of course, good science, but on the other hand, it's also really important that the PhD student develops as a good academic, both on a personal level and also in academic level. So I think there are so many aspects on that. So I do not know where to put the quality measure on.
Quality is elusive, of course, in that sense, and maybe we have also the responsibility to help people to become happy outside academia, as most of our PhD students move on to jobs outside academia, which is perfectly okay, as long as they believe that it's okay themselves as well. Yeah. Well, what is your take on a good supervision, and maybe also on the question, Danielle?
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic. So we definitely should take this a bit more seriously, because there can be quite some problems here. And I, for example, teach research ethics sometimes. And then there's always this point, either it's in the end of the workshop or maybe even when we are having drinks at the bar, that some people will say stuff like, yeah, it's very nice what you said about doing good research practices, but honestly, I don't think I can convince my supervisor about this, right? So this is, I would say, in terms of the research climate, very problematic. And if this is repeated behavior, there should be some consequences for this. One of the PhD students I'm very happy and proud to supervise, Andrea Kiss, studies also the opposite side, the interpersonal side. So yeah, sort of behavior about harassment, for example, or pushing people to work way more than they feel comfortable with, promoting overwork, and all sorts of other aspects that are not directly leading to bad science, but that might be driving young academics out of academia because they don't feel comfortable working in such a climate. And that is also, luckily, it goes pretty well. So the numbers are pretty good. She did some research on this, and most students are actually very happy. But there's definitely a group not so happy. And I think we should take that much more seriously as well.
Yeah, I fully agree. Michael, what is your take on this? Do you have a take on this? Of course, is the question.
Yeah, I confess I don't really. Yeah, this is way out my sphere of experience actually. I guess I'd be a pragmatist and say which of those models works best, but for to achieve the end result. But no, I'm really fascinated actually just listening to you all talk about this topic.
Right, Rik, I think it's different in the humanities. You think? When I entered the humanities a few years ago, I was so surprised that PhD students and supervisors seems to be competitors as well, writing their own papers on the same topic. That hardly ever happens in social science and the humanities.
Yes, that happens every now. I mean, I tend to do things like early on in a PhD trajectory, co-author a paper with a PhD student, right? Yeah. So get to know their writing style, they get to know my writing style. So I'd like to get to understand them and to move from where they are to what the purpose is, rather than starting what the ideal situation is, right? And I think it's fine in humanities to write papers on the same topic and just take slightly different views. Shouldn't be real competition there. I don't see the value of such competition. So more cooperation than competition, really. And I tend to, if I can, pay a lot of attention to the more personal issues in relation to the academic issue, as the character traits are often interwoven with work, right? And of course, that is a delicate issue because there are also clear boundaries. But it doesn't hurt to ask every now and then, how are you doing, right? And to take time for that. So yeah, I particularly like the fourth suggestion, namely to if necessary, remove the right to be a supervisor. So I hardly ever hear that, even though I know of a lot of people who pretty much screw up entirely. So not necessarily physical harassment, but just, for instance, just not responding to emails, right? Or not providing constructive, but only destructive feedback. That happens quite often, and I hardly ever see the right removed. So maybe that ought to be taken a bit more seriously.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, most of us will know supervisors that are spoiling case by case by case by case, and you should stay away from them. These are rare, of course, but then you have an indication to withdraw the right. And formally, at least in the Netherlands, the College of Promotions, the College of Deans that it is in most universities, have the formal possibility to withdraw the right to have PhD students. But it's hardly ever used.
Yeah, even though it takes so much, it takes 15 years to get the right.
Yeah, right? Or you can look at it from the other side and say, hey, we give the right to a PhD student that he or she can change the supervisor. So that if a supervisor is definitely not functioning, that there will be a way or some sort of guidance from an institute how you can change supervisor. I think something might work as well because, well, if I can continue, well, I just continue.
Yeah, I know.
You didn't give me permission, but let's be honest. I mean, the problem is is, to be honest, very, very big. If you look at the burnout rates, depression rate among PhD students, so much higher than in the general population. If you look at the waste, for example, that 30% of the PhD students that start do not finish their PhD. I mean, that's an enormous waste that we're facing. And I think not only mentally, but also in terms of financially. So I think we have a problem, and we should focus so much more on this problem, and all the four elements can help, of course, and we don't know exactly what will be the best yet, but I think at least focusing on it, making it better, give opportunities for both PhD students, but also for supervisors to withdraw from a supervision or something like that, I think can help in improving at least the supervision. Yeah.
Besides of all the practical issues, you plead for more flexibility there. In two ways. Tamarinde.
It is nicely added, actually. I was going to say that there's still a difference between sort of permanently removing the right to supervise and sort of temporarily removing it and putting people back to school. So I'm inclined to think that that might also be a nice thing to experiment with.
And you have a nice course, remedial teaching for supervisors. Now I understand it.
Yeah. Then we probably have to go back to course, Lex.
Well, most likely. Anyway, let's close the meeting. It's time, and you always need to stop on time, especially when the day is long. My feeling is that I personally learned a lot today. It was engaging, it was sparkling, it was interesting, and it was. Well, research integrity in action, I should say. We don't have together collectively all the answers, all the solutions, but we are working in a similar direction, and we exchange a few novel experiences and some interesting comments today. That gives me a lot of hope for the next 2 days of this seminar on research integrity, summer seminar, I should say, although it might be raining today. It's completely dark here, I have no clue. The point is that it is arranged very well by Samira and Doreen, the setup. It's not easy to arrange these things, and when it goes smoothly, it just means that a lot of effort went into it. And it went smoothly today, so thanks for the efforts to Samira and Doreen. I'd like to thank all the presenters on stage, on the screen. We had a hybrid meeting, and it was really nice. Unfortunately, the public was not hybrid yet. That will be the next stage, of course. Now I see you double or 4 times. That's really great. So we now don't vote anymore because the people on the screen are in the majority. I'd like to thank you all. I hope you had a similar experience. Yuri, you want to say one thing? He's a chair tomorrow. Yeah.
The survey. We are sending out.
Yeah, sure. Good point. Good point. And my fault. I forgot it. Now or tonight or early tomorrow morning, you will get a questionnaire. It's short. It's simple, and its single aim is evaluation of your experience of being a participant today, and that we use to improve new activities in the similar line of meetings. So please take a few minutes to fill the poll as soon as possible. Now your memory is fresh. Thank you, Yuri. I thank you all again, and we'll meet tomorrow again under the leadership of Yuri, who will be the day chair of tomorrow. Thank you very much. Goodbye.